Hi, my name is Dr. Dawn Bowdish. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Aging and Immunity, a professor at McMaster University, and this is the second of my series of talks on COVID-19 and SARS-CoV-2 and back-to-school concerns. The question on all our minds is, can schools open safely? And in my last talk, I talked a little bit about the vigilance we'll need to understand the symptoms as they show up in children and how this influences our infection risk. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the major adjustments that we can make. And fortunately, it's a very simple adjustment to make that can make our schools quite a bit safer. So first, let's refresh how the virus is spread. People who are symptomatic will be coughing and sneezing. They'll be releasing large droplets, which have a lot of virus, definitely sufficient to make someone sick. They'll also be releasing a lot of little tiny droplets that will go a larger distance and probably have enough virus to make somebody sick. Asymptomatic people will be spreading the virus through these tiny little droplets that when they talk or breathe will be released, but they won't go as far and they won't carry as much virus in them just because they're so small. So you have to spend a lot more time with somebody who's talking and breathing than you do with somebody who's coughing or sneezing. Let me show you one of the earliest examples that really highlighted the importance of these tiny droplets and spread. Here we have a restaurant. There are 5 tables, A, B, C, E, and F, and D is where the hostess or the host would sit. The person in yellow, A1, was symptomatic and came to the restaurant with members of their family who were sitting around the table. Everyone who's got a letter associated with the circle and has a red circle around it was somebody who became infected, and the people who don't have a letter did not. So what you can see is that there were 3 families seated at A, B, and C. Now, interestingly, family A was there for 3 hours, and each of tables C, B, E, and F overlapped for at least 1 to 1.5 hours. You can see that there were a number of infections in A, B, and C, but there were no infections in E and F, and furthermore, none of the wait staff or the host or hostess became ill. And to understand why this was the case, we need to look at a very important feature of this restaurant, and that's the location of the air conditioning unit. If you look on the right-hand side of the picture here, you'll see that there's an air conditioning unit and it's blowing air over table C, A, and B, and then it's hitting a glass wall. So the presumption is that the air circulation patterns were pushing the air over tables A, C, B, and then sort of looping back around again. And this was creating sort of a circular airflow. And as a consequence, people in tables B and C got infected, and people who were sitting outside of the airstream in E and F, despite being in the restaurant for the same amount of time, did not get infected. This was the first indication of the importance of airflow because, like I said, the wait staff didn't get ill, and although all these people over the course of their 3-hour meal at table A were no doubt using the bathroom, there were lots of common touch surfaces. It was only the people who were sitting in the airstream who picked up the infection. I'd like to show you another example. So this was in a Korean call center, and this was a multi-story building, but there was an outbreak that was pretty localized to the 10th floor. Every blue spot is where one of these call center workers sat who got infected, and every white spot is somebody who did not get infected. And if we look at the layout of this office building, we can see that these people were sitting fairly close together and they were working fairly long shifts. But then we also look at the people on the bottom half and we can see that there were actually really very few infections, despite the fact that these people would all be sharing the washrooms in the middle there, the elevators, the stairways, that sort of thing. So again, this is an interesting situation because people who work in call centers, they talk all the time, don't they? They talk quite a bit. And we could see that people who were basically in the line of fire and probably had some degree of shared circulating air were much more likely to get infected than people who were sitting outside of that area, despite the fact that there'd be lots of common surfaces that these people would touch. So again, this told us that air circulation, and specifically the circulation of these tiny little droplets that can float for a really long time because they're not very heavy, were key to spread of this infection. So the take-home message is that these tiny little droplets that might contain less virus, if you get enough of them, if you're breathing the same air for long enough, is sufficient to get infected. So what can we do to keep ourselves safe? Well, one very easy solution is helping to break up air currents. This video, which was taken by a news group in Japan, and I've given you the information so you can watch the whole thing on the bottom right-hand side, is used to show us just how simple it can be to break up air circulation patterns. Here they've opened 2 doors, and you can see that the smoke is just streaming out of the room once those doors are open. And when you compare the amount of time it takes to clean out a room that has 1 door open versus 2 doors open, you'll see that it's 45 minutes versus about 7 minutes. So just having a door open, and even better having 2 points of circulation, 2 doors, a door and a window, is helpful. You can also use a fan or an oscillating fan to help break up these air currents and to get air moving and out of the way so that these small tiny droplets are not building up. You can also use an air circulator, and all of these are really viable options for just changing circulating patterns in classrooms. Mask use is an excellent strategy. When we wear a mask, we keep a lot of our droplets to ourselves and we're less likely to breathe them in. But we also keep those droplets out of the air circulation. So the more hours of the day we have a mask on, the less of these droplets get into the larger circulation. So let's take a situation here, this mythical classroom I have. I have one student here who's symptomatic, and so they're producing big and small droplets and a lot of them. And then I have another student here who's asymptomatic, so they're producing a few of these small droplets. Now the students are in this mythical classroom are spaced 1 meter apart. In the case that these students are all wearing their masks, the symptomatic student might be making more droplets, they might be spreading some more virus, but it's unlikely that they'll be able to really, if they've got their mask on all the time, really spread it too far. The simplest solution, the easiest solution, of course, would be smaller classroom sizes. If we had smaller classroom sizes, the statistical likelihood of having an infected student would be lower, and of course it would be much easier to spread people out so we weren't in each other's cough and sneeze radius. But let's work with what we have, students who are sitting approximately a meter apart. All the scenarios I'm going to show you are based on imperfect mask use. Mask use is imperfect in healthcare workers and lab workers. It's certainly going to be imperfect with students, but the good news is some mask use is better than no mask use. So in this scenario, let's pretend our symptomatic student isn't wearing a mask. Every cough and sneeze is going to release particles that are going to go far beyond that 1 meter mark. They're going to go into 2 meters. These particles and droplets are going to contaminate the work surfaces, the floor, and importantly, they're going to contribute to adding to the virus in the air. So when the student is coughing and sneezing, and these large droplets will primarily fall to the area around them. So they'll sort of contaminate their work surface and anything that's on their desk, and those tiny little air particles could hypothetically get stuck in air circulation patterns, and then the students who would be most at risk would be the ones who are sitting upstream or downstream if there was an air circulation issue. But now let's pretend that our screening is perfect and we're not allowing any coughers or sneezers in the classroom, so we can eliminate the student from our model. And let's take the more likely probability that we're going to have some asymptomatic students, like the one up here on the right who's just producing a few droplets. So in this scenario, we've got our asymptomatic student who's, in this case, not wearing their mask all the time. They'll be producing some of these droplets, these small droplets that are infectious, but they'll be producing less of them. So now let's say there's an air circulation issue in this classroom and some of that air is getting pushed back and forth over these students repeatedly. You're going to have to spend a lot more time in this situation to become infected. Remember that Korean call center? They worked long shifts and lots of them, and still not everyone got infected. So what we need to take away from this message is that mask use, even if imperfect, and it will be imperfect, reduces the risk by reducing the number of droplets in the air. And we can also reduce the risk by spending less time in an enclosed surface. Any opportunity to be outdoors or into a large space is an opportunity to reduce the number of these droplets that are in the circulation. So how long do these droplets last in the air? Well, in this study, they took about 1,000 viruses, about enough to make you sick, and they looked to see how long they were in the circulating air for after 1, 2, and 3 hours. And you can see that they're still there. However, what's intriguing is in studies where they look at rooms that were inhabited by an infected person, but the person walks out and they wait 24 hours, they cannot find any of this virus still in the air. These little droplets are governed by gravity, and so eventually they fall down. And what do they find? They find that the floor is the most contaminated surface. So you can imagine that after the end of a school day, you close the doors, the windows, you turn off the fan, these little aerosols will eventually settle, and they'll be out of the air circulation for that day. So I've spoken about the importance of aerosols and air circulation in getting us infected. What about the things that we touch? Cleaning obviously takes time, and it might be best to use that time wisely. So things that absolutely need to be cleaned are things like high-touch surfaces. You can easily pick up 1,000 viruses if you have a large number of symptomatic or asymptomatic people touching the same doorknobs, and then you touch that doorknob. Anything that's coughed on or sneezed on by anyone who has any symptoms will have enough virus on that it could possibly infect somebody else. But what about the amount of virus on common surfaces that an asymptomatic person might touch and thereby leave less virus on? On the top left, we have copper. In this experiment, they started with about 1,000 viruses, about enough to give you an infection, and they saw that by 24 hours, there was absolutely no virus left there. Copper and silver have anti-infective properties, and so they actually kill the virus very quickly. Let's now look at cardboard, which we can assume is probably fairly similar to paper and probably has a lot of relevance in that you might be accepting handouts from students. Again, if we start at around 1,000 viruses, we see that by 24 hours, we're well below the level that you need to get infected, and by 48 hours, there's no virus detected. So what this means is that any piece of paper that a student or an infected person might touch can generally be considered to be clean after about 2 days. You can imagine that if you're using shared textbooks or other paper-based learning tools, if you could maybe rotate them in and out, so you touch them on Monday, but then not again till Thursday, or Friday, and then not again till Monday, that's probably as good as cleaning them and might be an efficient way for you to use your time and resources. Stainless steel, the virus can last a little bit longer, but again, I want to point out that the infectious dose is low by the time we hit 24 to 48 hours, and plastic, the virus seems to last the longest. So one of the strategies that we use in the lab for anything that's been touched by somebody who may be symptomatically or asymptomatically infected is we just seal it up for 3 days. And we know that once those little droplets dry out, the virus is no longer viable and doesn't pose an infection risk. I want to leave you with this, and it's a lesson that can be learned from your colleagues who were healthcare workers in Toronto at the very beginning of the outbreak. We had a significant number of healthcare workers infected with SARS-CoV-2 very early on. And there was a lot of concern that they might be getting those infections from their patients, or God forbid, giving those infections to their patients. That wasn't found to be the case. What was happening with the healthcare workers is they were getting infected in their community at about the same rate as anyone else. Our infection control practices were very good, so they were not spreading that to patients, but what they were doing is they were spreading it to each other. And so this is why I want you to beware of the break room. Those healthcare workers took their masks off to eat and drink and to socialize, as we all would during a break time. And so the transmission was occurring when they were interacting with their peers, not with their patients. And so as teachers, you are likely going to have a high index of suspicion of your kids, and you're probably going to be very meticulous about your mask usage and keeping your 2 meters apart. But you might be tempted to relax that around your colleagues. And so I'd really like you to all be very careful and remember that you need to have that same level of suspicion with your friends in the break room, with people in the office, and with parents. Any meetings that can be done outside are safer, or they must be 2 meters apart. So please be extremely careful that you're not inadvertently going to spread the infection to each other. To summarize this part of the talk, one of the most important things we can do is keep symptomatic kids and teachers out of the classroom, because that will reduce the risk for everyone. The outdoors is always safer than the indoors because natural air currents move those little droplets out of the way for us. It's especially important during nutrition breaks and when there's singing and shouting because we all release more of these droplets during those events. We can simply break airflow patterns in classrooms by opening doors and windows, and it is my sincere hope that all our children come home complaining how cold their classroom is. We can send them in a sweater, but by keeping those windows open, we're going to break up those circulation patterns and keep us all safer. Masks are going to be critical. Not only do they protect you by keeping droplets away from you, but they keep them out of the air as well, and that protects everybody. Distancing is essential, as is hand hygiene. If cleaning is impractical, leaving things for 3 days is probably good enough. And in my next talk, I hope to explain to you how the risk of infection in your own community dictates how safe or unsafe the classroom is, and when to get tested if there is an outbreak or an infection in your school. With that, I'd like to leave you with these further references to remind you that you can download these slides at my website and to thank you for your time and attention. To quote Bonnie Henry, be kind, be calm, be safe.